They should go their own way.
No, their own way is what's existing right now that I have sincere moral objections.
Yes, hold on. I know you're saying when the Chinese became democratic, they kept authoritarianism. Okay, great. When we became democratic, we kept slavery.
The United States came in and through its underhanded diplomacy, through its own efforts to provoke instability, instituted a government that was hostile to the ethnic Russians living in eastern Ukraine, who voted.
You got Dylan going now. You got Dylan going now. And I want to be clear,
well,
I'm not defending China. Just to be clear, that's not me.
I know, Larry, this is his fight. This is his crusade.
Hold on, I want to ask John Jackman.
It's his fight with the sparrows.
We're all settled in. We got our wiggles out, everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do it.
Great. Well, then, hello. Welcome, one and all, to yet another episode of the Hippy Dippy Podcast. I, Whick TV, will be your guest host for tonight as Dylan Burns, Counterpoints, Larry Sharpe, and John Jackman discuss tonight's topic, NATO. Should NATO lead America and Europe into the 21st century? Couple rules for the road for tonight. No slurs, no misgendering, keep it toss friendly. When I'm speaking, please be silent. And the opening and closing statement should be no more than 2 minutes. If during the open discussion you're having trouble getting in or feel as if you're being spoken over, please raise your hand or otherwise get my attention and I'll make space for you. If the conversation is stuck or if I don't understand what is being talked about, it's likely the audience doesn't understand what's being talked about. So I'll ask questions to keep both sides, to keep it flowing and to make sure that there's clarity. With that, let's discuss. We're going to start with counterpoints and we'll just go in alternating order. Counterpoints, your opening statement on should NATO lead America and Europe into the 21st century? Give us your thoughts, sir.
Yeah, this is going to be an obvious yes for me. I think that power abhors a vacuum. I think that if you look at the conflicts that have happened since World War II, they've largely been prevented through hegemonic power. I think that Europe and the United States of America are, natural allies due to historical ties. I think that keeping the Eastern European theater cold as best you can, considering current events, is going to be the best way forward. I think that withdrawing from the stage invites former rivals to assert their power regionally and eventually globally. And I also think that those regional powers, if you look at the governmental, political, and moral systems that they operate under, I subscribe to Joe Biden's perspective of you don't compare yourself to the almighty, you compare yourself to the alternative. I think the Western global hegemonic American-led order is preferred to the alternative. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Larry Sharpe. Please give us your thoughts on this.
NATO is a facade for American empire, and that's the problem. It is an empire. We've been at war since 1950. For someone to say it's kept the peace is a joke. We have been at war since 1950 constantly, but thanks to things like NATO, we haven't declared war since 1942. So America has been at war for the last 70 some odd 80 years. And yet we haven't declared war since 1942. Why? Because we have to become the empire. We have to become the police of the world. What does this empire do? The empire does several things. The empire creates the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex allows us to start having a jobs program in America so that other people can die and be hurt and be maimed and all those things. It is the wrong answer. It allows that now 60% of our manufacturing in America somehow is related to the military-industrial complex. I see it here in New York State all the time. Not just that, it destroys localism. It destroys local democracies. It destroys local freedom. It destroys everything local and by default then destroys our freedom. We are an empire. Basically, the advantage is that when the British Empire fell, they had a son, us. We took over the business. Most of the times when empires fail, things get terrible. They didn't get that bad for us. Why? After World War II, we basically had a monopoly on the world. We took advantage of that monopoly. We took advantage of our dollar, and we decided to totally control the entire world. So now what's the end of that? What happens now? The world begins to become angry at us. Europeans become angry at us. We're now responsible for almost every single war there is. And now the defense is bricks. So what happened is after World War II ended, we had to have NATO. I get it. I'm not mad at it at that point. But at one point, it had to go away. Once the Soviet Union fell, it should have gone away. And it didn't. So now what have we done? We've just made sure we kept the Cold War. NATO keeps the Cold War. NATO keeps us angry. NATO keeps our empire. It's a facade and should go away.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Dylan Burns. Give us your thoughts here.
Sure. I don't think that NATO's purpose was to stop all war or war on every continent. NATO's main purpose was to stop war in Europe, was to stop a Soviet incursion into Europe, a Soviet invasion in Europe. And now his identity has transformed into mainly counteracting the Russians and them pushing into Europe. And now many of the states that used to be part of the Soviet Union have joined NATO, trying to fight against that. The purpose of NATO was never to stop wars in, say, Africa, or wars in, say, South America, wars in Asia. What I think would be best with NATO is when NATO is as simple as possible. NATO started with 14 original articles, and most of those articles were either reaffirmations of the UN Charter or just clarifications on Article 5. And the really important part of NATO is Article 5, is collective defense agreement. People could take or leave the 40 partner nations of NATO. People could take or leave any of the counterterrorism operations or anti-piracy operations or any of the additional tasks that NATO has been given. But when it comes to the primary task, the penultimate task, the main task of NATO, which is stopping a Soviet invasion of Europe and now stopping a Russian invasion of NATO, which is now the main identity of NATO, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. NATO has been more than successful. It has been the gold standard in stopping that. There are countries that have been clearly defined as nations that the Russian government would want to invade or thinks that either they belong to them through some historical empire, some historical civilization that they claim allegiance to. I don't believe that Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, by destroying NATO, that would stop war. I think it could cause invasion. I don't think that by having all these Eastern Europeans abandon the alliance structure that has allowed them to have some sense of security after the chaos of the 90s, after the Soviet collapse and the Yugoslav civil wars, is smart. I don't think NATO is a good option. I think NATO is the only option to prevent the spiraling out of war in Europe. That's the simple, that's my practical argument. I have a moral argument, but I'll stay there.
Sure. We'll get into it, I'm sure, during the open. But last, but certainly not least, John Jackman. What are your thoughts here, sir?
Thanks for having me on. I think it's very clear that NATO is an aggressive and offensive alliance for the purpose of maintaining the U.S. empire. Now, NATO has taken multiple aggressive actions since the fall of the Soviet Union, including the dismemberment of Yugoslavia, its actions in Afghanistan, and its actions in Libya, all of which left these regions far worse off than they were before. Now, it's very clear that NATO, it's not even a question of whether or not NATO should lead the world into the 21st century. The real question is whether NATO does lead the world into the 21st century. If it does, what can be assured are that the organic bonds of sociality, which connect entire regions and entire civilizations, will be destroyed as they have been at multiple junctures. Now, once again, you don't even have to take my word for it, but you can take NATO leaders themselves who have said in the 2010s that NATO exists primarily to ensure security of the global energy system. Now, what does this mean? This means that NATO is a world empire. This means that NATO is made for the purpose of promoting U.S. hegemony in the interests not only of U.S. hegemony, but of the U.S. financial elites, the elites that are based in the United States and the collective West. And they will stop at nothing to expand this power. The notion that a defensive alliance rings extremely hollow when even the accession of multiple NATO member states was acquired through, as I mentioned, the dismemberment of Yugoslavia, among a number of other coercive measures. So for me, it's very clear. We can talk more details, but even at the very beginning of NATO, I think that you could argue that NATO was basically a holdover, a remnant, a way for the European colonial nations of centuries past to continue to promote a hegemony and global domination. And the scary thing about NATO is that it has taken us not only from a world in which nations, specific nations, can act like empires, but depersonalized institutions that don't even have the loyalty to a specific nation can act aggressively without having to declare war and destroy entire countries and regions for the benefit, again, of the major financial interests that have something to gain. So this is the purpose of NATO, and I think that it's not a question of whether NATO should lead the world into the 21st century, but that if NATO tries, it will destroy the world and take us all down with it.
Okay, strong words. Thank you for being here. And with that, I guess the first question I have for you all to kind of start discussion off here, both Larry Sharpe and John Jackman alluded to the fact that they feel that NATO, when we talk about NATO, it is simply talking about American empire. Do we all agree with that statement? And has American empire been a force for good or evil overall in the world? What do we think? Go ahead.
Yeah, don't worry, Wick. I got plenty to chomp down on. So listen, I have no problems with their assessment. I feel like this is like an IQ evaluation, you know, the bell curve where it's like 80 IQ, 100 IQ, 140 IQ. And it's like, you know, American empire exists, and then no, it doesn't. And then yes, it does. No, I agree that it exists. American Western hegemonic commercial empire, whatever you want to call it. I agree that it exists. It's a question of whether or not it's good. And so, Larry, you brought up an interesting historical fact that I think is indisputable, which is we haven't declared war since 1942. Well, the reason why we haven't declared war since 1942 is because we're not fighting nation states. Oftentimes we're fighting like paramilitary organizations or insurgencies or you know, like the Viet Minh or the Viet Cong, or we're fighting the Taliban or whatever. And what I would say to you is, while wars are incredibly destructive, kill hundreds of thousands of people, et cetera, most of the conflicts in the middle and late 20th century would be a bad month in World War I or World War II. On comparison, on the level of blood.
You're Marine like I am. We declared war on the Barbary pirates in the 1800s, and they were not a country. We have declared war against things that aren't nations. War does not have to be declared upon a nation. War can be declared upon a group of people, whatever it is. There's no rule on what you declare war on. We've done it before.
Okay, and you think that the war on terror, where we came out with the articles that like basically declared like jihadist organizations or anyone allied with Al-Qaeda, was an insufficient political declaration?
Of course, it was not a declaration of war. That's why we're still fighting it. People are dying right now. There are people. We just lost people in North Africa now. We lost them just recently. Why? Because we're still fighting this war on terror. Exactly. This is a terrible idea.
Why do you put war on terror in quotations? Why do you put war on terror in quotations?
Because terror is not a group, terror is an idea. Now, if they declared war on Al-Qaeda, I'm okay with declaring war on Al-Qaeda or declaring war on ISIS. That makes sense to me. Declaring war on terror, like the war on drugs. Whenever we declare a war on something like that, that thing wins. Terror won. The drugs won. That's not how it works. Poverty won. Every time we declare a war on something, that thing wins.
No. See, this is again where I feel like we just have a fundamental disagreement on it. Just because you declare that we are entering armed conflict against an idea. So, for instance, poverty. Of course, that's never going to end. But if you look at the past 50 years or 100 years, you can see the quality of life of human beings raising across the entire globe. When you declare a war on terror, and we're still engaged with that 20 or 30 years later, that's because there's still terrorist organizations that are around the globe that engage in jihadist terrorism and other forms of terrorism where they think that an acceptable tactic is slaughtering civilians. And we partner with largely organizations and countries that want to partner with us in order to combat those forces, because those forces are almost always negative. Like there's no terrorist organization that you could bring to me that I would be like, oh yeah, the IRA, when they flamethrowered a bunch of British troops and when they did a bunch of car bombs, you know, in Belfast. That was actually great. Like, you're never going to get me to say that.
If this was 1776, you would wear a red coat. I got it. What you just said. You've just said if it was 1776, you'd be wearing a red coat now.
I'm not a fan of British monarchy. I'm a bigger fan of republicanism, like you know, the American ideals that set up our country.
They hurt people, they shot people, they threw tea overboard, they did all types of things. It doesn't mean by default, because you don't like someone's tactics, that by default they're a bad guy. It doesn't mean by default we're a good guy. I'm not saying any of that. What I'm saying is we are an empire, and we are involved in things that we as Americans don't need to be involved in. That's the critical piece. We made a war on terror so that we can invade Iraq, so we can invade all other areas instead of just going after Al-Qaeda.
Can I comment on this for just a moment? I wanted to connect the idea of like NATO being an extension of American empire. And what I like about the original founding articles of NATO is that they're unbelievably simple. You can read them within 10 minutes. So it's not like hard to mislead people of exactly what they're about. And it's all built around Article 5. And what this means about Article 5 and the veto power is that if we want to add Ukraine, if we want to add Belarus, if we want to add Georgia, whoever it is, every single nation state has to agree. It's why when I hear like, oh, in 2014, NATO expansion is what caused the war, what confuses me is the Hungarians, the French, the Germans, the Turks, like half of NATO was not okay with the idea of Ukraine joining because they were terrified of the idea of something like that provoking a wider conflict with one of their major trade partners. And so when someone says it's an extension of American empire, if you give any one state, including Hungary, veto power, it cannot just be an extension of an American empire. It is also an extension of local sovereignty because they have an impact on how these decisions are made. And it's not just when it comes to veto power, it comes to the council. But one way these states could assert more power, and one of my main critiques of NATO, is more European defense spending, making up a larger portion of NATO defense spending, so America can burden share in a way that Americans more appreciate and is more fair to what's at stake to us and what we gain out of the relationship, which is economic trade, European stability, and a lack of a major World War II style event in Europe.
Well,
I like
John
that.
and Larry, I know you're
I'm not
ready to
fighting on
go.
that one.
I know you're ready to go. I just want to give you a little bit more to chomp on. Just a little bit more to chomp on.
Concise,
You mentioned
please, and then we
energy.
gotta give it to
I
John.
will be very concise. You mentioned that NATO leaders mentioned that they are effectively a global energy security apparatus. I would argue that's important. So do you not agree that that is important?
Well, security for who? Energy security for who? It's certainly not the energy security for the countries that NATO bombs and attacks. I mean, when NATO attacked Libya, for example, and I'll kill two birds with one stone here, it destabilized the entire oil infrastructure of Libya, threw it into the hands of a extremely unstable situation. NATO themselves, NATO arms ended in the hands of terrorists, of groups like ISIS. So when you're talking even about the war on terror, I actually don't disagree with you that the war on terror is a bad thing, or this notion that we need to fight terror, that we need to control terrorism, that we need to control things like radical Islamic extremism. But what actually happens, and Dylan points to this intent of NATO, but the problem is that no one has ever seen an intent. We don't see a defensive intent. We don't see a democratic intent.
It's in the founding
Let's look at the
documents.
The real actions that we see from NATO have been to destabilize countries, often using terrorist groups, radical groups as proxies, to destabilize countries and sovereign governments that are in the process of creating a sense of regional hegemony, of regional sovereignty, charting their own path so that they can promote their own culture, their own identity, their own sovereignty, their own traditions and way of life. But NATO wants to destroy that, and it uses human rights as a pretext in order to basically say, oh, this country is not acting in a way that's in compliance with the liberal set of values that we have in the United States and Europe. Well, this is basically just another colonial holdover. I mean, it echoes of the Heart of Darkness, the book by Joseph Conrad, where we believed that we had all the virtue in the West and that we were willing to use any amount of force and barbarity to impose our world vision on the rest of the world. And that's exactly what NATO's doing again. So again, through the funding of terrorists to carry out its missions, we've seen that not only in Libya, but we also saw that with these ethnic supremacists in Yugoslavia. We're seeing that, of course, in Ukraine with the neo-Nazis there and the Ukrainian nationalists who are direct descendants from Stephen Bandera, by the way, ideologically. So this is NATO's role, and when it comes to energy security, again, this is energy security for a transnational elite.
I would like to push you on
You
Yugoslavia.
didn't make Connor mad at all with any of that. Connor was like okay with all of that. He was like, yeah, that's true. Yeah, he loved it all.
Well, no, hold on. So I actually, well, yeah.
Well,
like,
can I just quickly say, when we talk about
One at a
NATO,
time,
there's a
one
few
at a time.
things.
That's great.
Oh, sorry, you can
Just
go,
real quick,
Connor.
real
It's
quick,
fine.
real quick,
I'll go
yeah,
last.
real quick. Connor, concisely, but
so-
then we'll give it to Dylan. Yes.
That's good.
Well, I don't know if I can because I'm about to kick another can of worms. When it comes to, Larry asked me a pointed question in a joking way, and I'll say it. Yeah, absolutely. Like the spectrum of diplomacy and warfare, like Clausewitz has this quote that actually really opened my eyes on conflict, which is war is diplomacy by other means, right? So when you're looking at what is politics? Politics is power and who is in power. Like, what are these political ideologies? They're how our societies are structured. And I think that there are real moral differences between, let's say, the system of liberalism or, let's say, authoritarian theocracy or authoritarian communism. I think there's real moral differences here. So if my ideology is actually evaluatively better than the ideologies that it's in conflict with, saying that my ideology came into conflict with an ideology that you think should have, like, I don't know, peaceful existence on another part of the planet, I don't really care. It doesn't really land for me, right? One of the things that I wanted to push, which is the can of worms that I want to kick, is the ethno-supremacists in the Yugoslavia. So my understanding of Yugoslav history is the fact that what happened was Tito was running, yeah, we need Larry back. Tito was running Yugoslavia, and it was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, polity where the Serbs had disproportionate political and military control. After Tito died, there was a power vacuum. The Serbs wanted to maintain the former maintain Yugoslavia. They started kicking the ass of the Croats and the Bosniaks and the Serbs and the Muslims and all that kind of stuff. And then the Croats kicked back, and then they started slaughtering the weaker section, which was the Muslim Bosniaks. That's my understanding of the conflict.
Right.
So I want to touch what you just said real fast. The last piece, not the Yugoslavian piece, not that piece.
Hold on. We're gonna keep it one at a time. Larry, you can address his piece you wish to address. Then
just a small piece about the von Clausewitz piece.
Then I'm going to let John respond to his response, and we're going to let Dylan in here. That's the order we're going to go into. So we're going to go Larry. We're going to go John.
I'm listening and I'm taking notes.
Yes. Look, on the von Clausewitz piece, which is what I'm going to talk about. You're right. I agree with you. Right. War is, diplomacy and other means, whatever. I agree with you. But I think America does best when it is the shining light that people want to follow versus the people bombing. I would say that our culture, when it is at its best, is far stronger than any Marine who lands on a beach, than any bomb we could drop, than anything we could do. I would rather us be the example that people follow. And one of the examples I'll give you is early on, after World War II, a lot of countries began to follow. Even after our first 1776, 1789, countries did begin to follow us. They did try to, and we weren't fighting everybody. I don't think we have to go to war. I don't think we have to join NATO. I don't think we have to be bombing people, and people can still follow our example.
Okay, John, please.
Yeah, I want to go into the Yugoslavia points just to really kind of understand this conflict. Because, of course, what you pointed out, Counterpoints, it's true. There was a vacuum. There were ethnic tensions in Yugoslavia and the Balkans for some time. But it was really the NATO bombing that exacerbated atrocities to a level that they hadn't been seen before. Of course, this was done under the pretext of a humanitarian mission. A lot of this narrative was actually imposed after the fact. But here's the reality on the ground. When NATO started bombing Serbia, the U.S. had complete knowledge that this bombing would escalate atrocities. In fact, NATO General Wesley Clark even said this explicitly. He worried that the bombing of Serbia would escalate ethnic atrocities, which of course it did. Now, the U.S. was trying to exert the dominant pressure that it had through the Dayton agreements in Yugoslavia for some time. But in many ways, I want to point out how the war in Yugoslavia was also an infringement on the sovereignty not only of Yugoslavia and the people in the Balkans, through this use of this massive military force and bombing campaign, which basically created a situation that NATO would have preeminence in the region. But it was also an attack on sovereignty of major European countries like Germany. The Europeans, Germany, France, had forces on the ground in Yugoslavia at the time. But when the United States decided to launch its bombing campaign, the United States knew full well that the response from the Serbs to that bombing campaign would be to attack the NATO troops that were stationed in Kosovo and Serbia and so on. And so part of the bombing campaign here actually put the strength and power over Yugoslavia into the hands of the United States, explicitly wrestling it away from who would have control of Yugoslavia from the other major European powers. So once again, this wasn't even just an example of the United States exerting hegemonic power over a government that it found unsavory, but it was another example of the U.S. exerting hegemonic power over the entire continent.
Okay,
Dylan wants to go real quick, and then I promise you we'll get a chance to respond. I do have a question for everyone involved to kind of maybe guide things a little bit, but go ahead, Dylan.
Yeah, when we started bombing the Yugoslav army, the war lasted like 73 more days and then it ended. So there was a genocide going on for 10 years. Then we bombed for 73 days and then the war's over. People talk about the violence that happened during those 73 days, civilian casualties. But there's also a mercy in ending a war, ending a genocide of 10 years in and of itself. This is not really a debate about specific Yugoslavia, though. I don't know if we're really going to get into let's talk about Srebrenica, let's talk about all these genocides. I think it's going to become too much of a diversion, but we can do that. As for NATO weapons and ISIS, I assume what he's talking about is a report that has to do with American weapons that we were shipping to Syrian rebels through Timber Sycamore, ending up in the hands of certain Syrian rebel groups that then traded hands again and again and again until they ended up in the hands of ISIS. But that is different than NATO weapons and ISIS, because NATO weapons and ISIS would suggest that it was a NATO operation sending NATO weapons from NATO states to ISIS. when it was an American operation sending weapons to Syrian rebels and then kept trading hands until it got into the hands of ISIS, which I do think is a little different because one is under the preview of America and the other is under the organization of NATO. For example, aid to Ukraine is coordinated by NATO. Aid to those Syrian rebels was not coordinated by NATO. So I would not call those NATO weapons. I would call those American weapons, and they were given to Syrian rebels, not ISIS, then traded hands because it was a very brutal and terrible civil war. As for NATO wants to smash local cultures and sovereignties, and that's their purpose. NATO was founded in 1949 with a ton of colonial powers in it. Great Britain, Portugal was still a dictatorship under Salazar, I believe. There was also the Dutch. They wanted to include Indonesia in NATO to make it protected by its boundaries. Salazar wanted to include Angola, I believe. I forget everybody that wanted to include everything, but it was clear from both, I believe it was certain American Congress people and others were clear that they would not accept NATO where these colonial possessions would be controlled, because no American wanted to go to war over Angola. No American wanted to go to war over Indonesia. Americans had just bled over Paris. Americans had just bled over Germany. They felt a lot more attached to that. They felt a lot more invested in that project. They did not feel invested in the project of colonialism. And so when Article 5 was originally instituted, these colonial possessions were not included. The only colonial possession that was included was French Algeria until the 1960s when the Algerians kicked the French ass. And then NATO was like, you know what? We're not going to be part of this colonial project. That's a bad vibe, chief. So if it was part of that project, if the purpose of NATO from the beginning wasn't the main purpose, which its articles clearly define, collective defense, and it was destroying local sovereignty, then they would have worked with Salazar to control the Angola. They would have worked with the Dutch to control Indonesia, and they would not have excluded it from Article 5 protections. That was done on individual countries basis, but not within the framework of NATO. Also, good examples, Larry, don't protect civilizations. You still need guns, you still need alliances, you still need collective defense to deter invasion.
No, you do. Of course you do. But first off, America's not going to be invaded. That's not a thing right now. I mean, maybe in 100 years, that's not a thing. But I'll go back to this. And the point is, yes, you do need guns to protect people. Of course you do. But look at Vietnam. You brought up colonialism. The United States went to war basically in Vietnam. First, this is the French. To try to
the United States. It wasn't a NATO mission. The rest of the NATO countries disagreed with it terribly, so NATO didn't participate.
Yes, but let me keep going. I said America. I didn't say NATO.
Okay.
NATO went into Vietnam, fought for about 10 years, give or take, dropped more bombs than we dropped on Japan and Germany combined, killed millions upon millions of Vietnamese, maimed millions, and then at one point just walked away. 1975, we basically just said, all right, we're out, we left. Now, you might go, wait a minute, Larry, we had to fight them, to fight the commies, or maybe Connor might go to fight the bad guys, or whatever he might say, right? We got to fight the bad guys. 10 years later, we're trading partners. You can now buy furniture from Vietnam. That's my entire point. You could just leave people alone, and they will often wind up deciding, okay, they'll be good. We will eventually do the right thing for us eventually. And if they won't, hold on.
Okay.
And if they won't, us bombing them doesn't make things better. They're still gonna be bad or whatever we decide is bad. There's gonna be, we spent 20 years in Afghanistan, 20 years to replace the Taliban with a better armed Taliban. We did nothing in our wars. We did nothing in our fighting. And that's my point. I'm not naive to think they're all gonna be awesome. But you're naive to think bombing them is going to fix them.
I'm not.
That is my point.
I never said it. I never said to bomb the Vietnamese.
Well, Connor said that.
Okay.
You kind of said that. Connor definitely said that. Yes.
I'll let Connor respond to that if it was directed towards Connor. But I just do want to say that we can't just trade our problems away with everyone. This neoliberal consensus that built in the 1990s, that if you just trade with the Chinese, they're all going to love democracy and they're all going to be singing the Hong Kong songs in a few years. That's nonsense. That's ridiculous. It's more than that.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's what you believe, but what I am saying is that I do agree with the Vietnamese, and you can tell from Ho Chi Minh's conversations with American officials and his love of the Constitution, his love of certain American values, and him attempting to contact American officials to try to advocate for the Vietnamese independence movement.
Yep.
I say that there could have definitely, in my opinion, been a different approach. Definitely when you know the Vietnamese
100%.
hate the Chinese, and it's not like they were going to be long allies forever. Yeah, I think that there was ways for us to work with them differently. But when we talk about, for example, and again, this is a separation between me and Connor. And that's why I love this debate. We have people from every single end of the political spectrum in here. In my view, my goal of NATO, which has always been the primary goal of NATO, is to stop incursion into the transatlantic area. Is to stop those incursions, because America is the #1 global reserve currency. Then you've got the euro, which is the second global reserve currency. If that area was to go into war, economic chaos, if those interconnected tradeways, which I mean, one of the main export markets for us is the Europeans. one of the main imports market for us is the Europeans. It will be extremely have a huge negative effect on Americans. And so for me, I think we should concentrate on the main goal of NATO. I want to keep NATO as simple as possible. I think that there's some like anti-piracy stuff that you might be able to do, but my goal is a simplified 1949 style NATO to stop war in Europe. That should be the primary, main, and most of what NATO does.
I just like bugging Connor because they're both Marines, but he's like an aggressive Marine. I'm a passive Marine. I just think it's funny.
Well, John, I'll let you go, but I'll say, like, I'll bite down on if you're like, hey, you're like a liberal hegemonic international bully. I'm going to be like, yes, that's me. Please continue. So, yeah, sorry. Well, go ahead, John.
No, you're good. It seems like we do have a bit of a political compass in here, although I think that I should be on the top left here. Larry's definitely in the right position there at the bottom right. Here's what I'll say is when it comes to Dylan's argument pushing back that NATO is not a tool of colonial or imperialist authority. I mean, the argument's just a bit silly because it goes along the logic that, well, NATO hasn't expanded into these former colonial holdings, therefore the infrastructure of NATO hasn't been imposed on Africa or South America, so therefore it's not a colonial institution. But the reality of NATO, the very nature of NATO, is to be a tool for the imperialist powers to maintain domination, and would have absolutely no good to impose Article 5 on these parts of the world that don't have that vested interest in maintaining a security umbrella under that of the United States. And I'll point to an example because I want to go back to the example of Libya, which is actually what I was referring to when I was talking about the proliferation of ISIS, the flow of weapons in Libya that ended up in the hands of ISIS and other radical Islamic extremist groups. I mean, this is well documented, and still to this day, we know that the bombing of Libya resulted in a huge flow of arms all across North and West Africa. But when it came to the bombing of Libya itself, I mean, there was an effort by the African Union at this point to engage in negotiations, to actually have the powers come to the table and find a diplomatic solution. What ended up happening is that a few days before NATO initiated its bombing campaign, which was spearheaded by the French and also the United States, they basically said, diplomats, you have to evacuate. We're going to launch this bombing campaign against Libya. And I think this is a perfect example of how the West prevented the African Union from bringing all parties to the table and actually engaging in a form of sovereignty and diplomacy that could have put Northern Africa on a much more stable track. And once again, the ill effects of this aren't only impacting the nations like Libya, which went from one of the most prosperous nations in Africa to literally a nation with open air slave markets and ISIS resurgence and all of this, but it also has a destabilizing effect on the other host country that has a parasitic relationship, or the United States uses a parasitic relationship on, which is Europe, which is having to deal with the flow of migrants that are coming now from North Africa and former colonial holdings, because precisely we do not want to allow the infrastructure, the means of production, to go into the hands of the people and governments of these regions and of these nations to use as they see fit. And I think this is the core of what we're seeing with NATO.
So I want to respond quickly.
We'll give it to Dylan. Points. We're going to give it to Dylan, and then we're going to give a counter. I know everyone wants to have a say.
So
Dylan, counter, and then I
don't want to rehash the intervention in Libya too much, but that was in 2011. NATO was created in 1949 with 14 articles. The main purpose of NATO, as I said before, as the articles clearly state, is the defense of the transatlantic area. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO had an identity crisis. It had no clue what it was going to do. But countries still clung to it because of the chaos in Yugoslavia, in the risk of instability, the risk of just not being part of the defensive structure. They wanted to be part of something that could give them stability. And you could shake your head, Larry, but the Poles disagree with you. The Bulgarians disagree with you. Half of Eastern Europe, actually the majority of Eastern Europe disagree with you. Now, they might be wrong when it comes to your interests, but when it comes to their interests, I think it makes sense that they would want the most powerful kid on the block in their neighborhood protecting them. In 2004, when the Bulgarians joined, they clearly said, we're joining because right now the Russians are down and out, but they're not going to be down and out forever.
For cash. They joined for cash, man.
Wait, what do you say they joined for self-defense. Self-defense, collective defense.
What's wrong?
You can advocate, don't call it cash if it's like self-preservation.
It's not about, they weren't afraid the Russians were going to invade. They wanted American dollars. This is about American money. This is all about the industrial complex.
Okay, I'm sorry, Sharpe. I'm sorry, Sharpe. This
No, hold on.
to me is the libertarian house count example, okay? Libertarians, once again, being completely dependent on systems they don't understand while feeling fiercely independent. The reason why these countries join NATO, you can say, that wasn't an insult to you, it was an insult to the libertarian movement. I love you, Larry. You're my favorite libertarian, and I mean that. I love you as an individual.
Thank you.
We just disagree fervently. My problem here is with Bulgaria, they openly stated that they were joining NATO because they understood that the Russians would not be down and out
Russia's
forever.
not gonna stay down
and they were right. And they're not the only ones who had this sentiment. And so when we say like, oh, they did it for cash, they did it for money, or they did it for the military-industrial complex, if that's the case, where is the military-industrial complex in these countries that they could kick in the high gear and beat back the Russians? Because in these countries, well, let me finish. In these countries, they do have military manufacturing, but the interests at play from the lobby power the military-industrial complex has in Bulgaria, Romania, versus the basic need of self-preservation of the state, which is the goal of every country at all times, is its own survival, which is basic IR, then yeah, the Bulgarians, I think, are going to pursue that. And I think it's a much more likely reason than we're doing this because of the almighty military-industrial complex, which is everywhere all at once controlling everything.
Okay, I need an opportunity to, it might be a little bit of friendly fire, but I'll try not to be too mean about it. Listen, these issues for me are not discrete. So what happens is John and Larry are accusing the American military-industrial complex, the global hegemonic mixed economy capitalist system, into wanting to get into these countries in order to get access to their raw materials. They're also accusing the locals of wanting to get into the almighty American hegemonic system because their elites will profit from it or whatever. But my point is that I believe in mixed economy capitalism. I think it's a powerful vehicle for success. I don't think that the poorest people in these foreign countries are worse off under the American liberal hegemonic order than they are under, let's say, an authoritarian communist order. And therefore, this isn't a bad thing. Getting into these countries, volunteering, like Latvia, Estonia, Bulgaria, all these countries, volunteering to become a part of like the European Union, if they were ever granted access to it, or if they just have preferential trade relationships, or if they have preferential defense agreements. These aren't bad things. And just because they're material doesn't mean that they're profane. Our lives are dominated by materials. Almost every single one of you, we're complaining about like oil stability and how we're always sticking our noses in everybody's affairs. But almost everyone on this video camera, if you look into the background, it's covered in plastic. Like 80% of the products that are on screen right now are plastic, and people are watching this on a plastic device. So I'm not going to go back to Yugoslavia just because I feel like we moved past it. But one of the main things that I want to address that I think has not been addressed so far that I want to make absolutely clear. I do not agree with Larry that we can leave people alone and then they are going to develop and they're just going to admire our model and then they're going to come over to our model. I think the perfect example of this is China. Mao Zedong, up until the 1970s, was very scared that his communist project was going to fall apart as soon as he died, to the point that he did the Cultural Revolution in the 1970s. Almost immediately after he died, there were capitalist sympathizers who completely revolutionized the Chinese economy within a matter of decades. Now, that has had incredible economic impacts, but they kept the authoritarianism. They kept the Han ethnic supremacy. They kept like the thought policing. They kept a security apparatus that basically monitors you on different degrees. And then also we have a whole bunch of alleged human rights abuses that actually are quite comparable to the National Socialists. But because economics are so intertwined, we cannot publicly criticize people who, in frankly, my mind, are morally monstrous.
So let me cover a couple of those, if I could. There's many of them I want to cover. The first one I'm going to talk about is NATO and the dollars piece. All I'm saying is what I heard from you, if I'm wrong, Dylan, you tell me. What I heard from you is they were afraid the Russians were going to invade them and destroy them, and that was the number one issue.
That was one of the, not just the Russians, but yes, that was a much more motivating factor than access to the military-industrial complex for profit.
But the military-industrial complex does several things for them. Number one, it allows us to pay for the defense. It allows them to not have to get nuclear weapons. It allows them to go off and do the things that I've been talking about, which is be capitalistic, make money, all those types of things. It allows them to do these things.
You keep saying cool things, though.
Yes, I'm not against that. That's a good thing. I'm happy about that. But you and I agree with this completely. I have a moral issue on this part, though, with you, Connor, which is you said if we leave them alone, they'll come to us and model our ways. That's not what I was saying at all.
To be clear, he said the opposite of that. He said we can't just leave them alone and then they will.
No, he said that. That's what I said.
Oh,
he said that. I said that, right? Right. And I'm not saying that. I'm not saying they're going to all of a sudden act like us or be. They shouldn't. Who the hell are we to make them? That's the point. They should go their own way.
No,
right? Let me finish.
Their own way is what's existing right now that I have sincere moral objections.
Yes. Hold on. I know you're saying when the Chinese became democratic, they kept authoritarianism. Okay, great. When we became democratic, we kept slavery for 100 years.
Okay.
After that, we then kept we kept Jim Crow for 100 years. We've done bad things too.
And if there was an international order that invaded us in order to end slavery, then I would be like, listen, it was a little messed up, killed a whole bunch of civilians, but they were kind of right about the slavery.
But we did it on our own, is my point. We did it on our own. We killed about 700,000 of our own people doing it.
While they were waiting for us to figure it out.
So who decides, and this is the other problem, when it may be slavery, that seems obvious to me, but some people would disagree back then. Our founding fathers would disagree with that, but whatever the case may be, your idea is that we should decide what's right, and we should use a gun or bomb or whatever, and you're nodding your head, to make that happen. And that is where my libertarianism kicks in hardcore. And this is not me thinking about a system I don't understand. This is a moral issue. It is not the right issue for us to come in and decide that some other nation should be like us and use a gun to do so.
Now, the last thing John's really chomping at the bit. I see his face.
Okay.
I want to give you one quote from Full Metal Jacket. Okay.
Great movie, by the way. Great movie.
Inside every single Vietnamese person, he uses a different word, is an American waiting to come out. And
I remember that.
From my perspective, Americanism is not like an ethnic thing. It's a concept. It's a system of ideas. It's a system of beliefs. And I do think that they're fundamentally correct.
Could you be any more jingoistic? I don't think you could be any more jingoistic.
Yeah, I could have used the G word.
Hold on. Let's give it to John real quick, and then we'll.
Good point. Point taken.
Let's be clear.
Yeah.
What Counterpoints is saying is not entirely wrong. I think that a lot of people have looked for centuries to America as an example of how to reclaim your sovereignty, of how to kick out an empire, whether it's through the use of force or whether it's establishing your own sovereignty through setting up institutions that are extremely effective and reconciling the contradictions of that present moment. But it's funny you point that out, Counterpoints. That's a funny quote that you use, because it was actually Ho Chi Minh who quoted George Washington during the Vietnamese armed struggle as a justification and a comparison for how the Vietnamese were actually fighting a similar struggle against the Americans. So to the extent that there's an American inside everyone in the world, maybe there is, but that's only insofar as those people are demonstrating their own right to self-determination, their own right to sovereignty, and to claim their own resources, their own tax dollars to use to the development of their own civilization. Now, I think that is correct. But here's my point. That when it comes to this global system that we have, you're kind of acting as if things are existing within a vacuum. And you use China as an example of authoritarianism. On one hand, pointing to the fact that China introduced all of these great economic reforms that led to all this development, which is absolutely true, while still being under the very wise stewardship, I would say, of the Chinese Communist Party, which is exactly the reason why they were able to use those gains to actually go back to benefit the society, to actually result in a social development for the Chinese people, because we've seen plenty of countries, plenty of examples. India being the most comparable of another country in the region, a huge country that has not escaped from under the boot of U.S. hegemony and has seen a very different path in its development over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. What's the key difference here? It's sovereignty. And to the extent that China has instituted a number of things that you characterize as authoritarian or dictatorial, this has largely come in the context of the entire capitalist world converging on China to try to reverse the gains of the revolution. And of course, more recently, this new Cold War that we're in, that aims to blunt China's influence in its own region, in its own backyard. So of course there's going to be a level of political crackdown. But I don't think that you could really give one good example, you or Dylan, of how the United States, of how other countries impose a form of dictatorial or authoritarian qualities that the United States itself doesn't replicate. So here we find that we are mired in an empire of hypocrisy. Basically, every time you point the finger at that country for being a dictator or authoritarian, I can point to you a number of examples of the United States doing the same thing. Here, I invite you.
Okay.
Okay. I have a. I definitely have.
Take up the challenge, but then I do have a question that's been on my mind that I really do want to ask to both sides.
Okay,
One for each. But go ahead.
We're doing good tonight, guys. We're doing good.
Okay. Gauntlet. I'm going to pick up your gauntlet, and if I need to ask you again, just remind me. But I want to hit a point that you brought up, before. So one of the things that you said, or at least one of the things that I inferred from what you said, is the fact that there's a difference between the sovereignty of individuals, overseas or countries or whatever, making their own determination. And one of the things that's really interesting is you guys brought up American interventionism that has failed. I think the most obvious ones being like Iraq, Afghanistan, right, in the war on terror. What I would cite to you, which, NATO, the reason why this is prescient, or the reason why this is important, is probably because of Ukraine, right? And the reason why I would say that Afghanistan fell within 11 days. The reason why Iraq lost half of its territory within 2 weeks of guys in white trucks is exactly because of what you said. It's because people conceded territory that they didn't care about, sovereignty or authority that they didn't want to fight and die for. And as a result, they had to redouble their efforts later in plenty of blood and treasure in order to restabilize their countries after the fact. And so that's well taken. But what I would cite to you is Ukraine is actually an example where you do have a population on the ground who is willing to fight, because what was supposed to be a very easy steamrolling of the current Ukrainian government has turned into a 3-year protracted conflict in which Ukrainians are still going into the trenches in order to fight. So that's what I would cite to you, is there are people who are willing to fight for this. I'll respond to the gauntleted question. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
So
that's
yeah.
what
Okay. So
I'll encourage you to get to, because he made a very
Sure.
specific ask. Can you point to anything?
The specific question: What is the authoritarianism that was not
America
replicated
does
by
not
within the United
replicate
States?
currently?
So China currently stands accused of having a 2 to 3 week turnaround on vital organ transplants that is likely taken from the prisoner industrial complex. Then on top of that, China does stand accused of having Uyghur Chinese folks of that ethnic and religion, they're largely Muslim majority ethnic enclaves. They are accused of culturally re-educating them in work camps, as well as taking Han Chinese men and forcibly introducing them to Uyghur women. I don't think that you can find that kind of moral evil in American history for 150 years.
Well, the United States stands accused of forced sterilizations at the border. The United States also has by far the largest prisoner population of anywhere on the earth. If you look at it in proportion to China's
forced sterilization as a policy? Or are you talking about like individual instances? Because that would be a difference. Yes.
I'm talking about a policy.
There's a policy if you cross the border and they take your ovaries.
Well, I'm saying, these are allegations, right? You're trying to.
Well, there's just not enough control for that to even have been possible. Well, no, I know that there's been instances of sterilization, but it's not a policy of sterilization across the southern border for anyone who comes in. That's not a thing.
Please point to me to the policy of organ transplants. I invite you to look it up.
I didn't say that. It's Connor, but I just asked you about your policy. That's a pivot to Connor. I'm asking you a question.
Well, I was giving an example of how the United States.
Yeah, and I'm asking you, what's that policy? Is there like a law somewhere, or are they like? Because I can point to you the laws in China banning. Wait, no, just quickly. I can point to the laws in China saying like, hey, if you name your kid Muhammad, the type of social benefits you get are going to be different. I can't point to a law in the United States. If you cross the southern border, we're going to take your ovaries. That's a little different.
Please.
Okay, now you got to let him respond.
I would love to read that law about naming your child Muhammad in China. Please find where they dissuade people from doing that.
I'd love to. One second.
If that's true, that's please send that to me. But the point is,
by the way, I'm not
defending
China at all.
In 2017, the Chinese here it is, right here. 2017, the Chinese it took me 5 seconds. The Chinese Communist ban enacted bans of lists of Muslim names it deemed too extreme or might have, and I quote, connotations of holy war of spiritualism, aka separatism. Examples include Islam, Quran, Mecca, Jihad, Imam, Saddam, Muhammad, Hajj, Medina, among others.
And then hold on real quick. It also took me only a few seconds of internet research in order to find China publicly saying that they're no longer using the organs of executed prisoners, which I'm assuming if we're saying that it never happened, then why are they saying that they stopped?
And I want to be clear. I'm not defending China. Just to be clear, that's not me.
I know, Larry, this is his fight. This is his crusade.
Hold on. I want to ask John Jackman.
It's his fight with the sparrows.
Sure. John Jackman, you said that there was a similar policy given at the U.S. border, right? Can you, again, name that policy? I want to give you a very clear chance to answer that.
Well, I'm saying there's plenty of policies that have been enacted that don't give people sovereign control over their own individual bodies and over their own public health decisions in the United States. I mean, this is well documented. Well, such as the COVID epidemic.
This is a pivot. This is a pivot.
You're forced by large institutions. Well, I'm just saying it's a pivot, but
I just want to know about, because if this is real, I want to change this law. That sounds horrible.
The medical decisions, that individual medical decisions,
I want to save Mexican ovaries
by an individual private citizen. And so I'm saying that there's comparable examples in the United States as well as in Europe of the same level of authoritarianism being employed and being imposed on individual sovereign citizens to make their own free health decisions, for example.
Yeah,
and
John,
when it comes to the level of a level of just raw destruction that is brought against people who speak out against the United States empire, the clampdown on freedom of speech. We're seeing that across the table right now, where people who are talking favorably of Russia are being investigated, are being prosecuted, that people who go on the airwaves and speak favorably of issues that the United States finds unsavory can become political targets themselves. China targets extremism. The United States targets extremism in its own way. But of course, the United States is doing so from a position that is much more unstable and insecure, because the United States is losing its foothold as the global dominant hegemonic power. And so we're now seeing
I have a rebuttal.
I understand.
I never got an answer to my question.
They're being imposed on behalf of large capital interests.
He's saying
I didn't hear anything about Guatemalan ovaries in that statement. It was a lot of.
But just hold on. But just so I understand what is being said, John Jackman, is your assertion that America is less stable than countries such as Russia or China? Is that what you were asserting today?
Okay. Well, I think one can make a very strong case the United States is in fact less stable than countries like China and Russia. You can just look to
John. I don't want to interrupt you. I don't want to interrupt you, and I don't want to smirk too much, and I don't want to be too much of a smartass. However,
sure.
Let's use one as an example. People being suppressed for their God-given right to conscience and free speech in the Western world. I think probably the most extreme examples that you could think of that were public were Snowden, Assange, and the Tenet media revelations recently, right? So Julian Assange was accused of like a sexual assault beforehand. It was likely used as a pretext in order to keep him suppressed into the Ecuadorian embassy. But he also stood accused of basically stealing government secrets unredacted and publishing them worldwide, which ended in the deaths of intelligence figures, worldwide. When it came to Edward Snowden, he did try to do the whistleblowing, and some people revere him for that. But he, I actually think that's probably the more egregious of the two cases. When it comes to Tenet media, these people could have worked for Russia as, declared foreign agents or whatever. But what they did instead is they got people to funnel money through shell companies into their organization, thereby like bypassing declaratory laws about FARA, working on behalf of a foreign government, which, by the way, is a rival. So I see this as, you could say, like, is this really free speech? Are we feeling like governmental pressures to go a certain way when it comes to the narratives that we chose? I could agree with that, relatively speaking. But what I would say is during the Hong Kong protests in China, there were like half a dozen to a dozen protesters who were killed by cops. And one of the most egregious stories was like a teenage girl who was found handcuffed and thrown into the river. So like for me, like if you take, you have to declare that you're working for a foreign agency, or law enforcement will handcuff you behind your back and throw you into a river, I have a clear moral preference between the two.
Okay. I
Well, it
do
sounds
want to.
like- it sounds like
I'll
there's
let you
some-
respond briefly, but then we got to get back to NATO, right? We were getting
Yeah.
a little off here. So respond very concisely, very briefly, and then I have a question to get us back on track. And it is to your side first, and then I have a question for Dylan and his side as well. So respond,
Well,
and
it
then I'll
sounds
ask.
like there's not. It sounds like there's not a historical appreciation for the level of authoritarianism in law enforcement in the United States, where people have, of course, been the right to trial. We still have Guantanamo Bay, where we have prisoners that have not been given the right to a trial.
How many people are in Guantanamo
there've been-
Bay?
There's a number of high-profile examples. I mean,
How many
you can
people?
go back to Fred Hampton.
And
You
wasn't there
could
an
go back
effort to
to
shut it
prominent
down?
leaders.
Like, I don't remember like Xi Jinping saying, "Oh, I don't like these Uyghur camps. These are bad." That's not even like a debatable issue.
Where there was established law enforcement connection to literal assassination attempts. If you speak out against the U.S. government, and if you do so in a way that's effective enough, they will kill you. That is the reality. So you want to point to these terror stories in China? Well, I can raise you a number of my own here in the United States. And if you're talking about
There
fair,
were
I mean,
30
there's a
men in
number
Guantanamo
of
Bay. 30.
Okay.
well, great.
Now-
Prisoners of Guantanamo Bay over the last couple of decades. It's been more like thousands still. And so,
So they've shut
reality.
down like the Uyghur camp. They've stopped the mass surveillance. They were like, "Oh, this sucks. Actually, we love burgers and freedom and all the whatever." They did
Can
that.
we do NATO? I'm
Yeah,
getting bored.
let's get back to NATO. That's true.
Let's do NATO.
Okay. Once, yeah, I got a
Thanks.
question for Larry and
Thank you.
For John as well. Given, right, that both of you have said that you think that national sovereignty is important and that NATO encroaches on and in some cases violates the national sovereignty of others. My question for you, is there ever a situation or a set of circumstances where you think that a country's national sovereignty should be encroached upon? And what would those circumstances be? And if NATO isn't the answer when we need to encroach on another sovereignty, what would be the answer to that? We'll start with Larry, and then I want to hear
Sure. A couple of things. It's a difference in a way between saying, and I hope this will be a good example. I didn't know this question was going to come, so I hope I'll do a good example for this. Do I think there should be a draft, or do I think people should voluntarily join the military? Now, I do think America needs a military and a strong military. I'm a veteran, all right? I believe in that. But I do not believe in a draft. Why? I think that if America is a great country, and it is, that we will often, and if there's some attack upon us, people, young men particularly, will volunteer to fight wars. And that's been true for centuries. And I think that will still be true. How do I bring that up? I don't think we require NATO. I don't think we require something like that. I think instead we have a UN, which is fine. We can keep that. If there is a situation where countries believe there is a problem or something, then countries should get together and do something about it if need be, right? The idea of throwing Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait is a good example of something like that. Now, look, I don't like us fighting in Ukraine. I do not. However, it's countries getting together to fight in Ukraine. I don't personally like that, but that doesn't matter. You don't have to have NATO to push Russia out of Ukraine. You could have a bunch of countries getting together and pushing them out of Ukraine. You don't have to have NATO
what
for
would
that.
the
So
substantive
my point
difference
is,
there be, just out of curiosity?
the difference is
between
once
NATO
sure, I'm
being an
giving you-
alliance of countries versus
Yep.
an alliance of countries that doesn't call themselves NATO.
because once you have a standing alliance, you by default create an us versus them mentality. That's how it's been always. It's how it always is. NATO now has to have an enemy, right? Even Connors, he's shaking his head. Yes, it's true.
I want NATO of the planet. I want to fight space
which
aliens.
case-
This is a waste of time.
But
I
I'd
don't want to
be
fight
okay.
Russians.
I'm with you. Yes,
We need
so
to
that's
fight
why we shouldn't have NATO. Let's have UN NATO, whatever that is, if we don't want NATO. Let's do UN NATO. Yes, that is the difference.
Greater United States of America. Yes, absolutely.
I'm not sure I want to go there, my friend. I know where you're going with that. But you asked that question. That would be my answer. I don't want to stand in because it
Volunteer.
creates us versus them. If people are doing something wrong, then we volunteer, get together, and we fix it.
John, same question.
So I think we need an understanding of what we mean when we're talking about sovereignty. And where does sovereignty come from? I mean, this comes from the organic development of communities, societies.
You keep using the word organic. What does that mean? I don't know, and I don't think the audience knows.
It means It means the types of cultures and traditions that arise from the population, that arise from that society historically. And they're organic based on their continuity, based on their level of attachment to the land, to the historical culture, to kind of a common identity and common form of society. And there's a lot that goes in to that, obviously. But when we're talking about the sovereignty of nations, what do we mean? When we think about nations, there can be nations that are developed on artificial terms. I'm thinking of nations such as Israel or even Taiwan, whose perseverance has been established only through the domination of a unipolar global power. If it weren't for that unipolar global power in the United States, there wouldn't even be the existence of these entities. So when we're talking about sovereignty, we should understand it from more of a sociological standpoint, more of a historical and civilizational standpoint, not through the standpoint of just individual nations. Now, I think in general, the principle is that all societies should have sovereignty. They should have the ability to determine which direction their culture and their traditions
Certainly, but
develop.
the question
That cannot be done under the umbrella of a unipolar power, which is foreign to most of the communities in which it operates, in which it has its military excursions and its interventions. And I think that NATO at this historical juncture in particular is against the development of that sovereignty for other regional powers. And it wants to promote this uniform kind of set of values that has been produced and upheld by the liberal world order based in the United States.
To be clear, the question is, under what circumstances should a nation's sovereignty be encroached upon? What would be, in your opinion, a justifiable circumstance where a country or a group of countries can encroach upon the sovereignty of another?
Well, when a nation doesn't have...
There might not be any, in your opinion. It's up to you.
Right. Well, I think the example of Ukraine actually is a good example in Russia's special military operation. Because what you had here was an example where there was a democratically elected government. The United States came in and through its underhanded diplomacy, through its own efforts to provoke instability, instituted a government that was hostile to the ethnic Russians living in eastern Ukraine, who voted...
You got Dylan going now.
Primarily for that former government. And I know I'm going to get Dylan going. So my goal is to get him going a little bit. And so in this case, you had a tradition and history of Russian culture that was based in, for example, Crimea. And you wonder, why were the Russians able to walk into Crimea without firing a shot? Well, it's because Crimea was historically part of Russia. It was part of this organic sovereignty actually of Russia. So this was not illegitimate sovereignty of Ukraine's. Crimea was only given to Ukraine as part of an administrative transfer in 1954 under this this notion that the Soviets wanted to go into this kind of multicultural experiment. And it was this really gesture of good faith to Ukraine that they were going to build up another multicultural republic, even though Crimea had historically always been part of Russia. It was Russian speaking. Always. And so, of course, when it goes into Ukraine, the majority of Ukrainians...
No, I have a smart ass response. I'm ready.
Take me again, I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to actually talk here.
I want to hear this desperately. I'm in.
I think
we're gonna give it to the other people. Yeah. Has your point been made, John? Has your point been made? Do you feel like your point's been made?
My point has been made.
He gave me more than enough.
Go ahead.
So I'm sure Dylan can get into the nitty gritty of history, so I'll definitely let him go second. But I wanted to point out that when it comes to organic, naturally developing, right? We're human beings. The truth is that a healthy chunk of what we do is socially constructed, and I would see social construction as a form of an extension of organism. So when it comes to liberal republicanism, there's very clearly a conflict within human society between the individual and the collective. And I think that liberalism, which is kind of like a rule set around the individual, and then republicanism, which is like the rule of law and like collective responsibility, I don't think it solves this conflict, but it gives you a tool through which to resolve conflict over time, largely through peaceful means, which is oftentimes through like elected democracy. That's why I like republicanism. And so I think republicanism is infinitely more preferential on a organic, natural, evolutionary, cultural level for people to be able to express their desires, because oftentimes in authoritarian societies, you just have the authoritarian saying, this is the way it is. And then you have individuals suffering under the yoke of that collective authoritarianism. And then here's another thing about naturalism coming into our politics. So I believe it was Socrates. It was one of the dialogues or something like it, like Xenophon's dinner or something like that. And there was a really powerful Athenian man who was complaining about how democracy was such a pain in the ass. And all it is really a bunch of weak people voting in their own power, and how the powerful of society should just be let loose to do as they please, because clearly the gods have ordained them to have like additional wealth and power and influence and money and all that kind of crap. And so Socrates, being a smartass, basically responded like, hey, but isn't democracy a natural outflow of the weak banding together in order to restrain the strong? And so when you look at these organizations, you're saying that Taiwan isn't organic. You're saying that, Israel isn't organic. You're saying that, I don't know if you apply this to Ukraine, but parts of Ukraine aren't organic. I would say that these countries reaching out to their regional neighbors and reaching out to international partners in order to assert their sovereignty is a very natural, very organic development. I do have more, but I'll leave it there for the sake
We're
of
going to give it to Dylan. Hold on.
I want to do one sentence, and I'll shut up. One sentence, and when I'll shut up.
One sentence, Larry. Then we're going to go to Dylan, because we got a lot to cover, not a lot of time.
The reason why I don't want the war in Ukraine is not because I support Russia. I think Russia is awesome at all. Russia is obviously the bad guy, horrible. I hate us fighting in Ukraine because I don't want war. I'm a bleeding heart libertarian. I want the war to end. Just be clarity, I'm not supporting Russia. Their fault. They shouldn't have done it. I just want the war to end because I hate war. That's all.
I want to clarify just my position real quick before Dylan goes, so that way he can go based on
concise. Dylan has to go though, but be very concise, please.
But I'll be very quick. So my position is not a uncritical support of Russia, and it's not even saying that, for the example of Ukraine, all of its sovereignty is illegitimate. What I'm saying here is that the natural development of relations between Ukraine and Russia, absent a foreign influence of the United States and NATO, would be one of cooperation, would be one of building this channel, this Eurasian economic interconnectivity that NATO actually wants to interrupt to preserve its global hegemony. So that's my position.
Okay, Dylan, go ahead.
Brotherly nations, the Ruski Mir has arrived. One thing on the stability stuff. This is way old. I just haven't talked in a bit. That Russia is more stable than the United States. I don't know if Blackwater marching on Washington, D.C. while shooting down fighter jets and helicopters because they had a disagreement over who should get what resources by the DoD, okay? Comparing American stability to Russian stability, when the type of politics and internal affairs, which we don't even get to see everything that's going on in Russia, purposefully, by design, so we don't know a lot about these internal tensions. When it's hard for me to hear we're less stable when we haven't had something like that happen here. Okay, I'll just throw that out there quickly. As for how the war started, the Euromaidan movement was promoted by a few factors. The first one has to do with, and this is one that's covered probably the least, is corruption. Corruption's been an issue in Ukraine since the end of the Cold War. It was an issue in Ukraine before the Cold War, and it's still an issue in Ukraine today. They have done certain things, have like public bidding on government contracts, stuff like that, to try to deal with it. That has been helpful, but it was still a major issue that was angering people. So that was a social tension that was there. Then, in the middle of the night, Yanukovych decided, after pressure from Vladimir Putin, where he stopped 50% of trade with Ukraine using economic coercion that the Russians said in the 90s they would not do in the Budapest Memorandum, he pulled out of an association agreement that he ran on instituting when he ran for office in 2012, Yanukovych. He did this in the middle of the night to try to suppress protests, because if he did it during daytime and people found out about it, well, then more people would be awake. People still came out in protest. The Berkut was sent, special police, beat them very hard. People did not react to that well. The protest movement got bigger, and bigger, until Yanukovych tried to outlaw protesting, was hiring gang members to brutalize protesters, which were referred to as the Tutushki. This is well documented, until eventually over 100 people were killed in the Heavenly Hundred, and the Yanukovych government, after trying to ban protesting, fled the country and a new government was instituted. People tried to say it was the United States and American influence and this, that, and this and that. I think it was the lack of dignity that Ukrainians were treated with when they were getting shot. I think it was a lack of dignity that Ukrainians were feeling when their money and public funds were being stolen constantly. And nobody can tell me that Yanukovych was not terribly corrupt. He was actively involved in crime in his youth, and he was actively involved in crime while in office. The factors that pushed Yanukovych out are primarily by Americans viewed from an outside, it's us versus the Russians perspective. But when you get into Ukraine and you talk to people, it's a lot more diverse. There's a lot more issues that motivated that protest movement. But The main factor was the fact that the Russians were trying to tell the Ukrainian government what to do with their economics, what to do with their trade policy. That's what motivated Euromaidan. People can say the United States did it through dark money, this and this and this and that. It wasn't United States dark money. It wasn't US CIA agents. It was a bunch of people disrespected, brutalized, who took too much, pushed too far, and then they fought back. As for the idea that if the United States was not here, there would be a productive relationship between Ukraine and Russia, I don't believe that at all. The Russian government banned the Ukrainian language during the empire. They were trying to suppress Ukrainian identity. They went to Ukrainian poets and they killed them. And the same thing happened during the Soviet period as well. They tried to suppress the Ukrainian identity. Many of them had to flee to Austro-Hungary because it was the only place where they could practice their literature, they could practice their language. The idea that all of a sudden big bad America came on the block and then Russia was like, oh, we got to be mean to Ukraine now, or oh, we're doing this because you don't know what's good for you, it's the NATO. It's ridiculous. The Russians have a colonial relationship with the Ukrainians. They're trying to reinforce that colonial relationship with the Ukrainians. And the idea that this is an example of organic, for example, in Crimea. Crimea is the worst example you could use for organic because there was ethnic cleansing.
People say I'm long-winded. I love you, but
I'm sorry, I've got to end this. There was ethnic cleansing in Crimea. Crimean Tatars were put into trains and then shifted out by Joseph Stalin, thousands and thousands of miles away. And then they moved Russian speakers, ethnic Russians, in to get better control of the warm water port, which is a strategic asset, strategic resource to the Russians. Okay. They didn't just do it to Crimea; they did it to the Koreans. They did it to many peoples.
I gotta let John respond if he needs, and then I see your hand. Counterpoints. Go ahead, John. Do you have a response to this? Keep it brief. We already.
Yeah, well, Dylan wants to paint things all black or all white. What I'm actually saying is that we actually need to introduce a level of nuance here and understand that there was a push and a pull happening in 2014 ahead of Euromaidan. On one hand, you had a significant threat that Russia perceived of Ukraine, its longtime brother nation, being incorporated into Europe, into the fold of the United States in Western Europe. And on the other hand, you had the United States that was also recognizing that, wow, there's a significant population who has supported President Yanukovych, that President Yanukovych is accountable to and having to make decisions for the Ukrainian government, which also played a role in the decision to pull out of the agreement with the European Union. Now, I know that Dylan wants to discount the interests of the people living in eastern Ukraine, but I think that we have to take them into account. The reality here is that the foreign actor who's exerting undue influence on the situation is the United States. I mean, we know this, we can see this even in the calls of U.S. leaders themselves. Victoria Nuland had an infamous call where she literally, before the new government is installed, is handpicking that government themselves.
Have you listened to the call?
Okay, hold on. I think we need a definition of concise. I think that maybe we need a debate on what concise means.
We're all YouTubers and live streamers.
You're all guilty here of this.
I did my sentence. I was good. I did a sentence.
Larry's been the best. He gets gold star.
We need to introduce a level of nuance here, and I believe that I'm doing it.
Okay, counterpoints. Go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the things that I know that we're trying to be brief, but one of the things that one of my favorite historical studies ever was Afghanistan before the Taliban, after U.S. withdrawal. And the reason why is because, you're saying undue influence. Okay. And I understand that. But one of the things that I opened this conversation with is power abhors a vacuum. And so if you actually look at the Northern Alliance, if you look at the Hazaras, if you look at the Taliban, if you look at all that kind of stuff, each one of them had a sponsor state. Hold on. Sorry. I almost said that wrong. But good God, why can't I think of it? But Iran was supporting the Hazaras. The Northern Alliance was being supported by the Uzbeks and Tajiks. The Taliban was being supported by a bunch of Gulf states. And then rivals to the Taliban, who were also Islamist, were being supported by Pakistan. Thank God I finally found it. So anyways, the point is that power abhors a vacuum. If there's an unstable nation that doesn't have like a clear dominant power, then other countries are going to play it to their economic and diplomatic interest. So for me, I know a lot of people, particularly libertarians, they don't like that the world is play or be played, but I don't exactly have like the biggest sympathy for people who apologize for Russia or China, because they're not making defenses of Russia or China because they want the United States to withdraw from the world stage and then everybody's going to start holding hands and there's going to be regional peace. It's because they want to play the same game. They just want to be the dominant force.
Okay, so we are kind of...
Did I say that?
No, you didn't.
Okay, good.
Sure. We're getting kind of low on time, and I don't want to go over, but I do have one more question for Dylan and Counter that I want to get to and answer quickly before we get to wrap it up, closings, etc. So we have the United Nations. They have a provision in their treaty that allows for the removal of suspension of a member's benefits to kick a member nation out if they misbehave. The European Union has a very similar thing. NATO does not. What do we do, or what should NATO or an alliance like NATO do when you have, because of as Counter mentioned earlier, the interconnectedness, right, with people? What do you do about nations like Turkey, for example, who, again, some members have decided, oh, I don't know if we like these anymore. So, again, if NATO has no provision for ending a membership, how does NATO handle corruption in its own ranks when corruption rears its head?
I have the meme answer, so I'll give you the meme answer instead of Dylan's serious answer. I think they absolutely need to add a provision in order to kick out member states that are, additionally corrupt or they engage in warfare that is brinksmanship, et cetera, et cetera. And I think Turkey is exactly the example that I would think about. Them, trying to seize territory in northern Syria, them trying to seize territory in northern Iraq, them, fighting our allies, in northern Iraq. I would love to kick them out, and I would love to take the western side of the Bosphorus back for the EU and NATO, and we can have all the chill Muslims live on the western side of the Bosphorus, and then boom, rest of Turkey is for all the a-holes.
Gotcha. Okay, Dylan, what are your thoughts on this?
Kick out the Italians. I don't like them. No, it's for me, it's when we first started NATO, there was this idea that it was a democratic alliance. But there were certain strategic locations like Portugal and the islands that they had between the Atlantic that were so beneficial to us strategically that we overlooked it. And it wasn't just in this instance, it's also happened in the 21st century. People forget, but there was a revolution in Egypt against a dictator that was very close with the United States. And it was Obama kind of shrinking away from him. That was kind of like the final nail in the coffin of his regime falling. He wasn't part of NATO, but it's an example of like, for strategic interests, the West and most countries, and the communists did the same thing. Every alliance ends up doing the same thing because states end up pursuing power. They're willing to compromise on these values. And so I would say Turkey being a member state now, while having democracy issues around freedom of the press, is nothing new for the organization, but I also think we should hold the organization to a higher standard. For us to have, for example, like the EU, they have a system where Viktor Orban is one of the most corrupt public officials in all of Europe. Hungary has some of the highest standard of the highest levels of public sector corruption, constantly taking EU funds and funneling it into corrupt projects to the point where it's a joke, where people will go in and actually take pictures next to these corrupt projects. It's not just them. Other countries are corrupt in Europe too, but the Hungarians have a corruption problem. And so how the EU responded is by freezing funds, trying to add pressure on them. We don't have any mechanism on like that in NATO, and it might be because it's a defense alliance, and the idea of adding those types of things that could whittle down Article 5 or whittle down the deterrence element of the alliance might be risky, but I wouldn't necessarily be against it, but I haven't really thought enough about it.
Fair enough.
No. Hold on. This is you guys are actually making my point that I made up earlier, right? Why bother having a NATO? Join them when you want to join. If the Turks don't want to join us, they can stay home. They don't care.
NATO is the longest.
NATO, well, then maybe we shouldn't have them. That's my point. We join up when we want to join up.
NATO is the longest lasting military alliance in history. I believe the last one that went not even close as long, it was an alliance against Sparta. I think it was like the Athenian alliance or the Athenian Congress, like 4 BC before Christ. Let me finish.
Larry.
Larry, I understand that.
Point.
Hey, I'm trying to give you credit. Can I give you? Well, I didn't finish my response.
Go ahead. I'm
sorry. Very briefly. Then we're going to let Larry respond, and then we're going to.
I'm quiet. I'm getting good.
Over 75 years, we have all standardized NATO ammunition. We have standardized our weapons, so everything is interchangeable. We have built a very competent NATO command that now encompasses over 1 billion people. It is the strongest military alliance on the planet, no holds bars. It holds ultimate deterrence potential. But once that 1 billion people becomes 50 million here, 100 million here, 30 million here, it's a lot easier to divide and conquer, especially in places like Moldova, where the Romanians and the fact that they have a relationship with them while being in NATO might dissuade further intervention in Transnistria. Once NATO's not there, what would stop, for example, the Russians taking their illegal troop deployments, pushing forward, and taking the rest of Moldova? They're already interfering in their politics, funneling money, etc. So I do think there's a purpose for it defensively.
Okay.
Okay,
Larry,
so-
respond briefly, then closings. Go ahead.
Yes, my point was that I want us to make these things when we need them, because what happens is what you're talking about.
You
More
need them when you
control-
need them. It's like you buy a gun, you
finish.
put it on
Yeah,
the wall,
let
you
me-
have it
let
ready
me
for when the
go. Come on,
burglar
let
comes
me
in.
go.
I was good. Let me finish. What I'm saying here is what's going to happen is what you just said. We're going to start having more control. Early on, I said these things begin to destroy freedom and localism. That's exactly my point. You're talking about it. No, they can't do this unless you do that. You can't do this unless you do that. All of a sudden now they're controlling more and controlling more. No, the answer is no control, no more power over these people. When someone does something wrong, the community of nations gathers together when they need to get, like Kuwait. Kuwait's a small country, and we pushed Saddam out of Kuwait. We should have invaded Iraq because of 9/11. That was dumb, right? But pushing him out of Kuwait, sure, and we did it. We got together. I'm not against countries getting together to punish someone who does something wrong. There is no need for NATO. It should go away. You guys just made my point.
Okay. Gang, this has been a robust discussion. There's so much to this topic. We didn't get a chance to cover it all. Maybe we have part 2 sometime. But I'd like to thank everyone for being here and give them a chance to have closing statements. And so, yeah, we'll just go in the reverse order that we started. And we'll start with John Jackman, and then we'll end with Counterpoints. John Jackman, go ahead. Closing thoughts.
Well, what we see from the pro-NATO argument is basically an argument for social chauvinism that kind of mirrors the colonial and imperialist legacy that we've seen from Europe and the United States for centuries. Because in the end, the one common thread that you'll find for all the targets of NATO is that NATO hates when countries or peoples stand up for themselves and are sovereign. They don't want to see strong and sovereign nations in South America. They don't want to see strong and sovereign nations in Africa or Asia either. And when nations make a effort to reclaim their resources and to build up their own infrastructure based on their own social needs that are determined by the people in a democratic process that is connected to the needs of the people, then NATO will stand up against that if it counters the interests of NATO. Now, NATO, of course, has no problems when it says, you can be our ally, of course, if you have the right financial rules, if you have this kind of liberal economic world order that is favorable to our financial interests, our banks, our corporate monopolies, and so on. Then, of course, there's no problem. But the minute that a country wants to take hold of its own resources and wants to begin to develop like Libya and put social programs in place that are actually utilizing things like the oil for the development of its own country and its own infrastructure, then NATO has a problem with that. And you'll see that theme over and over again. And when NATO actually is either defeated or is forced to reconcile with its own limitations, that's actually when you see countries begin to prosper. Of course, the example of Afghanistan was mentioned multiple times. Now the Taliban have control and the United States has ceded control of Afghanistan, and you're actually beginning to see a level of stability begin to reemerge. Now, I don't want to hold that out. That's too much of an example. But the same thing could be said of Iraq. I know it wasn't a NATO intervention, but it was a United States one. And Iraq is beginning to flourish once again in the aftermath, coming out of the boot of American imperialism and intervention. So NATO as a whole is basically used as a weapon to maintain a source of intimidation for countries and regions that are maintaining their sovereignty. And it has a backstory, it has a history that is riddled not only with the legacy of imperialism, a incorporation of the British imperialism that was basically taken over by the United States, but even some of the most pervasive forms of Nazism were incorporated into early NATO. Its propaganda arms were staffed by Nazis. Even its top brass and leaders were former Nazi commanders. And now today, we live in a world where there are organic, I'll say organic again. I know that Dylan doesn't like when I use that word, but we see these civilizations beginning to emerge because of their historical continuity, because cultures go beyond even just a century, but that are historical, that are centuries and centuries old, that are through the interplay of different states, nations, societies, and communities, beginning to re-emerge. And that's why I call them organic, because they're time-tested, and they're coming as a result of historical moment and proving themselves, like in China, like in Russia, like in Venezuela, other parts of the Middle East, that are reasserting themselves and are reclaiming their own destinies.
And that's the 2 minutes. So unfortunately, yeah. But thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your points, and would love to have you on again. Dylan, go ahead.
One question. and I just heard enough words and like combination of words to think this. Have you read a lot of Dugan?
I've read Dugan. I'm not going to deny I've read Dugan, but I wouldn't say that he's one of my main philosophical influences at all.
Are you at all like associated with like
Okay, we can't. Hey, no, these are
MAGA communism at all, or like any of that stuff?
We got a hard cutoff at 8:15 here. I'm getting your producers angrily being angry, right? So
you probably see a little bit behind me.
You guys can
I'm a member
discuss
of the American
book club later.
Is that MAGA communism? Is that the same thing?
Oh my God. Dylan, is this your closing statement?
I'm starting control. I'm asking. I'm curious. Can I not ask the people I disagree with what they believe? I'm sorry.
Not during closing.
Okay, then let me do my closing. Let me do my closing. Let me do my closing. Okay. Let me do my closing. Okay.
We're trying to get to your closing. It's your closing. Go ahead.
Okay.
Please.
I recommend people go or listen to the Victoria Nuland phone call. I recommend they listen to it in its entirety, because something that's really interesting about it is she talks about the need for the protesters to accept a deal with Yanukovych, that they want them to accept the deal with Yanukovych, because if they accept the deal with Yanukovych, then they can avoid the crisis of Russian interventionism. The protesters then did not do that, did everything to get Yanukovych out of power, and did not listen to whatever Victoria Nuland was suggesting. So if it was an extension of American empire, it seems like the Ukrainians were not good subjects. As for like me not listening to Eastern Ukrainian interests, my fixer's from Donetsk. Most of my friends are from Donetsk. Most of them have been displaced. Many of them are Baptists that have had their churches destroyed by the Russian army because the Russian does not like Baptists. Well, they don't really like many denominations of Protestants in occupied territory, period. But I care about their interests too. That's why I want them to be able to return to their home. I don't see this war as black and white. I think that there is a lot of like gray in the middle, but in Bucha, there's just purely black. Outside of that, I will also say that in occupied territory, there's private property rights are fickle. Free speech is not existent. Freedom of press is not existent. And the Russian government is spending about $60 million to block VPN access in their country. So they want to completely block out any alternative perspective from going into the country. If your worldview and your empire is so strong, why is it that foreign podcasts are so scary and dangerous to your people? If your ideas are so good, why is it that Putin would never go on a show where, for example, like this, where they disagree with people instead, or, listen to disagreements instead of shutting them down, putting them in prison, if you even call it a war instead of a special military operation? As for NATO, and this will be my last thing, we talked a lot about Iraq. We talked a lot about things that are like going into a car and criticizing the cup holders and the desk, but not talking about the engine, not talking about the wheels. The main purpose of NATO was defense of the Euro-Atlantic area. It has succeeded in that. If you join NATO, you're not getting invaded. Its main purpose has been an utter success in that purpose. We didn't get to discuss much of that purpose. Instead, we talked about Libya, Iraq, and a bunch of things that are not the main purpose of NATO and have not been fundamental principles of NATO. If we're going to redefine NATO, then we need to move away from the types of interventions in Libya and towards building Euro-Atlantic stability. That's my ending point. Oh, and also Nazis were hired by both the Soviets and the United States, including in the military.
Stop cheating.
Sorry.
Man, he's doing a coup of his own panel, right? Okay, this is a revolution, a color revolution, if you will. Larry Sharpe.
I'm taking like 20 extra seconds because of him.
Oh yeah.
Anyway,
okay,
no, I'm kidding. No, the piece I want to bring up here, and again, thanks guys for having me. I love when I come on these shows. I enjoy tremendously. And Connor, you are my buddy, man. I love you, brother. You're awesome.
Love you too.
I 100% believe that the world is not perfect and there will be problems all around. My point is, I don't think we need a standing alliance like this. We should get countries together when there's a problem. Standing alliances by default breed corruption and control. We see it every single time. There are many reasons why there are world wars, but many of them right before them, there are lots of alliances. And all of a sudden we have a massive world war. I'm not saying it's the only reason, but they facilitate us versus them. I want us to not do that and focus instead, not on NATO versus someone else, but individual countries doing individual things. What winds up happening is several things. Control, but something else. The military-industrial complex becomes part of it. Everyone has to buy my bullets, or has to buy my guns. Let's have some more people join us. We can buy more things. America is in a place right now where about 60% of its manufacturing base is somehow linked to a military-industrial complex. That means government spending, Connor, you know what I'm talking about, is fueling the U.S. GDP. That is not good for us. We are building things to send overseas to bomb people versus building things that people want here in America. 10% of our manufacturing is weapons. That's way too high, right? We should not be doing this. It's not good for us. It also forces us to fight with our dollars. We're de-dollarizing. The BRICS is because of NATO. That BRICS came up because of NATO, right? That's what happened. That's why it happened that way. They were trying to find a way to make that happen. I'm unhappy with all these things. I'm not naive enough to think that people will all of a sudden become us, but I have a moral issue that I think some people disagree with, but I'll say it anyway. I don't think getting people to be better in their own way, in their own time, is our job. And I think if we want to take it on, we should take it on not through bombs and guns, but take it on by being the right example. And to be forward, I do think we should be defending our sea lanes and such. No worries about that. I think trade is not the be-all, end-all, but damn it, it really helps. It makes things better. If I have a choice of bombing a country or trading with them, I would rather trade. I think NATO's not required. We can still do it. Let's end NATO and have a better world.
Okay, thank you for being here. I really appreciate you. And last but certainly not least, we're going to go to Counterpoints, whose time has been absconded by Dylan, but we're going to give him the time anyway. Go ahead.
That's okay. I'll try to be very effective with my words. So I would take everything that the opposition said and I would literally flip it on its head and say, cool, like social chauvinism. All right. Liberalism, republicanism, mixed economy, capitalism, all those things are great. Hate independent and sovereign nations. I don't hate independent and sovereign nations, but I do think that cooperation breeds health and peace and wealth. When they reclaim their resources for themselves, oftentimes what you're talking about is nationalization and specializations that they don't have the ability to do. I'm thinking of Iran and I'm thinking of Venezuela, where they nationalized their oil resources and then they didn't have the ability to develop them for decades because they didn't have the specialization to do so. I'm thinking of the fact that those oil resources are now currently being held hostage against the global market. And since they were overly reliant on their energy as a part of their economy, the ones that got away with their sovereignty tanked themselves. So yeah, favorable to banks and international corporations. Banks are vehicles through which money spreads, and international corporations are businesses that are trying to trade internationally. Comparative advantage between multiple countries trading with each other is not a bad thing. I don't think it's bad at all. Then buy my bullets, buy my guns. You're right. We design good guns, and so do the Europeans, and we should buy each other's guns, and we should buy each other's bullets. That's all based. We're building guns instead of bullets, or we're building guns instead of building other things. Building the other things is what our allies do. It's called comparative advantage. Taiwan focuses on microchips. Korea focuses on electronics. Israel focuses on electronics. We now produce oil, so on and so forth. We all have our strengths, and we should all play to our strengths, and we should be better together. Create these alliances when you need them. I do disagree. I think that creating alliances as we need them is what caused World War I and World War II to slowly suck us into the whirlpool of international intrigue. I think a little bit of conflict now is preventing a whole bunch of conflict later. I think an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And finally, I do rescind me kicking Turkey out of NATO, because while I was joking about that, because, I hate the Turks and I love Polish people more, the truth is that Dylan was correct that using leverage in a alliance in order to get people to behave properly is the best way forward. So with that, thank you, you lovely people. It was very fun.
Beautiful. It's been a great show. Thank you all again. And don't change that channel. There's going to be more Hippy Dippy content coming up.
Oh my fucking God. Jesus Christ, what a show. Wow. Talk about a program.